Hello everyone, my name is Shraddha and welcome to my YouTube channel, Node of Biology. In the previous video, we discussed about what is a cell, learned the three different domains of the living world, and differentiated between prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms. In case if you haven't watched that video, please follow the link in the description box. Today, we will take a small tour inside the cell and briefly discuss the common structures that are found across all types of cells and discuss one of them in detail. Every living species on Earth, be it the plants, animals, bacteria, yeast, or mold, are made up of cells. Some living organisms are made up of multiple cells and thus they are called multicellular, and some are made up of just a single cell and hence they are called unicellular. But whether an organism is made up of a single cell or multiple cells, they still share certain common things. The structures commonly found across all types of cells include the plasma membrane, cytoplasm, ribosomes, and DNA. Plasma membrane acts as a separating boundary between the intracellular and extracellular environment of the cell. Cytoplasm is the fluid-filled interior of the cell. Ribosomes are the protein-making machinery of the cell, and DNA that stores the hereditary information of the cell and determines how the cell is going to be built and how it is going to function. On the right side, I have shown an illustration marked with the common structures found in both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cell. Now let's discuss the first common structure in detail, plasma membrane. Each cell is covered by a protective layer of membrane known as its cell membrane or plasma membrane. The plasma membrane defines the boundary of a cell. It selectively allows the movement of certain substances to enter and exit the cell. It also facilitates communication with other cells by sharing its own information or by helping other cells to identify themselves. Now, these functions which are performed by the plasma membrane are because of the components with which it is built. Thus, the principal components of the plasma membrane include phospholipids, proteins, carbohydrates, and sterols. Now, on the left side of the slide is an illustration of cell membrane of an animal cell, and on the right side is an illustration of a single phospholipid molecule. Let's discuss the components of the plasma membrane in detail. Phospholipids. They make up almost 40 to 50% of the plasma membrane. A phospholipid molecule is made up of a hydrophilic head and two hydrophobic tails. Now, what does hydrophilic and hydrophobic means? Hydrophilic. Philic means loving or attracting. Hydro means water. Therefore, it is the water-loving or water-attracting head of the phospholipid. Hydrophobic. Phobic means fearing or hating, and hydro means water. Therefore, hydrophobic tails are the water-fearing or water-hating tails of the phospholipid. A hydrophilic head is made up of glycerol molecule and phosphate group. Because the phosphate group is negatively charged, the overall charge of the hydrophilic head is negative. And because of this, the hydrophilic head is also known as the polar end of the phospholipid. The hydrophobic tails are made up of two fatty acids, and because these fatty acids do not have any charge, the hydrophobic tails are also known as the non-polar end of the phospholipid. Now, all the biological membranes are usually composed of two layers of phospholipids, with their heads facing towards water and their tails facing away from water. Such an arrangement of two layers of phospholipid is known as a phospholipid bilayer. Now, in this bilayer, one layer faces towards the outer side, that is towards the extracellular environment, and one layer faces on the inner side of the plasma membrane, particularly towards the cytoplasmic side of the cell. Next component is proteins. Proteins make up almost another 50% of the plasma membrane. There are two types of proteins which are found in the plasma membrane, integral or intrinsic, and peripheral or extrinsic. Now, there are some integral proteins which extend throughout across the phospholipid bilayer. Those proteins are known as transmembrane proteins, as shown in the illustration on the left side of this slide. And peripheral proteins are usually found on either face of the plasma membrane, either on the outer face or on the inner face. Next component is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates make up another 10% of the plasma membrane, and they are exclusively found on the outer surface of plasma membrane. In the illustration, the green colored sugar side chain facing the outer face of the plasma membrane are the carbohydrates. They are usually made up of 2 to 60 monosaccharide units, and if they are found attached to proteins, for example, in this case, one of the sugar side chain is attached to the transmembrane proteins, and hence they are known as glycoproteins. If the sugar side chain is found attached to the lipids, then they are known as glycolipids. Sterols. Now, sterol is the last component of the plasma membrane, and the type of sterol which is embedded in the plasma membrane depends on the type of cell. Since in this particular illustration we have cholesterol embedded in the plasma membrane, this means that this is a cell membrane of an animal cell. Now let's quickly summarize the components of the plasma membrane. Phospholipids, they are the framework of the plasma membrane, occupying almost 40 to 50% of the plasma membrane. They are amphipathic with hydrophilic head and hydrophobic tails. They have a bilayer arrangement inside the plasma membrane. Next component, proteins. They occupy another 50% of the plasma membrane. There are two types of membrane proteins, integral or intrinsic, and peripheral or extrinsic. Sterols. The type of sterol found in the plasma membrane depends on the type of the cell. In case of animal cells, the sterol is cholesterol. Carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are found in very small amounts, around 10%. They occupy only the outer surface of the phospholipid bilayer. They either bind to the lipids, forming glycolipids, or bind to the proteins, forming glycoproteins. They form typical cellular markers on the cell surface for recognition. The cell membrane is fluidic in nature. Now, what gives the cell membrane this fluidity? This can be explained with the help of the fluid mosaic model of the cell membrane. This model describes how the cell membrane is built and what functions does it perform. Now, as discussed, the four components that make the plasma membrane include phospholipids, proteins, sterols, and carbohydrates. Now, these four components are distributed in different proportion across the entire cell membrane. And when we zoom into any region of the cell membrane, these four components are arranged in a fashion giving rise to a typical pattern which is known as the Mosaic pattern. And because the cell membrane is in constant communication with the extracellular and intracellular environment of the cell, these four components are constantly in motion, giving rise to the fluidity within the cell membrane. By that I mean that because these components are constantly moving, this motion is responsible for giving fluidity to the cell membrane. In other words, the fluid mosaic model states that the phospholipids, proteins, along with other components, move freely within the cell membrane, making the membrane a fluid structure. A 1-minute summary of cell membrane can be divided into its structure, location, and function. Structurally, the cell membrane is made up of phospholipids, proteins, carbohydrates, and sterols. Phospholipids have a bilayer arrangement in the cell membrane, and each phospholipid has a hydrophilic head and two hydrophobic tails. Proteins, there are two kinds of membrane proteins that are found, integral protein and peripheral proteins. Carbohydrates are found on the outer surface of the cell membrane. Sterols, the type of sterol embedded in the plasma membrane depends on the type of the cell. Location, the cell membrane forms the border or the boundary of the cell, separating the intracellular components from the extracellular component. Functionally, the cell membrane is selectively permeable, controlling the materials that can enter and exit the cell. and it allows or facilitates communication with other cells. For future videos like this, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel, Node of Biology.